History rarely announces its arrival with a shout. It does not begin with a parade, or a televised address, or a sudden explosion that everyone can see. Instead, the most profound shifts in human civilization, the kind that topple empires and redraw maps, begin in silence. They begin in the quiet, sterile rooms of high finance, amidst the hum of servers and the scratching of pens on ledger paper. They begin with a whisper that is ignored by the masses, until it becomes a scream that can no longer be silenced. On November 15, 2024, such a whisper echoed through the subterranean corridors of the global financial system. It was a tremor that the seismographs of the mainstream media failed to register, or perhaps chose to ignore. While the world was distracted by the theater of domestic politics, by the circus of celebrity culture, and by the daily noise that fills our screens, the tectonic plates of the global economy shifted violently. China, the sleeping dragon of the East, executed a maneuver that historians will likely look back upon as the opening salvo of the greatest financial war in human history. In a coordinated, clandestine, and ruthlessly efficient operation, the People's Bank of China initiated the liquidation of $3 trillion in United States assets. $3 trillion. To the human mind, a number of this magnitude is almost abstract. It is a figure so vast it loses its meaning. So let us give it weight. $3 trillion is greater than the entire economic output of the United Kingdom. It dwarfs the GDP of India, a nation of over 1 billion souls. It is enough capital to purchase the entirety of Apple, Microsoft, and Google, the titans of American industry, combined. This was not a market correction. This was not a rebalancing of a portfolio. This was an exodus. But what makes this event truly terrifying is not the size of the sale, but the method. China did not stand at the podium and declare economic war. They did not flood the open market in a way that would trigger immediate circuit breakers. They moved through the shadows. They utilized a labyrinthine network of offshore intermediaries, sovereign wealth funds, and custodial accounts located in jurisdictions like Belgium and the Cayman Islands. They operated through the dark pools of global finance, executing the trade in silence, systematically dismantling their exposure to the United States dollar while the rest of the world slept. How do we know this happened if the television screens are silent? We know because the data leaves footprints. For those who know where to look, those who track the Treasury international capital flows, who monitor the custody holdings of the Federal Reserve, and who analyze the subtle anomalies in bond yield curves, the evidence is undeniable. The capital is leaving. The great decoupling is no longer a theoretical risk discussed in think tanks. It is a kinetic reality happening in real time. To understand why this moment is the precipice of a catastrophe for the American way of life, we must first rewind the clock. We must understand the architecture of the world we have lived in for the last 50 years, a world that is currently crumbling beneath our feet. For half a century, the United States dollar has enjoyed a status unique in the history of money. It is the reserve currency of the world. This is not merely a title, it is an imperial privilege. It means that when a factory in Tokyo buys steel from Brazil, they pay in dollars. When a frantic trader in London buys oil from Riyadh, the transaction settles in dollars. The dollar is the oxygen of global commerce. This system, often referred to as the petrodollar system, was born from the ashes of the gold standard. In 1971, when President Richard Nixon severed the dollar's link to gold, the world entered a new epoch. To prevent the dollar from becoming worthless paper, the United States struck a deal with the House of Saud. The agreement was simple yet profound. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars, and in return, the United States would provide absolute military protection to the kingdom. The result was alchemy. Suddenly, every nation on Earth needed dollars. If you wanted energy, you needed the greenback. This created an artificial, insatiable demand for American currency. It allowed the United States to do something no other empire could ever do. We could print our prosperity. We could export inflation to the rest of the world. We could run massive deficits, fight endless wars, and consume far more than we produced, simply because the world had no choice but to absorb our debt. It was, as the French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing once called it, an exorbitant privilege. But privilege unchecked breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds downfall. For decades, the United States has abused this trust. We believed the demand for the dollar was a law of physics rather than a fragile social contract. We printed trillions upon trillions of dollars to patch over the cracks in our economy, funding bailouts, stimulus checks, and bureaucratic expansion. We diluted the value of the very asset the world held as a store of value. Worse, we weaponized it. In recent years, the United States has turned the global financial system into a tool of foreign policy. We sanctioned nations we disagreed with. We froze the central bank assets of sovereign countries. We cut adversaries off from the SWIFT payment system. We sent a clear message to the world. The dollar is not a neutral utility. It is a weapon, and if you cross Washington, your national savings can be confiscated with the stroke of a pen. China was watching. Russia was watching. The global South was watching. They realized that holding U.S. dollars was no longer a safe haven. It was a liability. It was a trap. And so the counteroffensive began. This brings us back to the silent liquidation of November 15th. This sell-off is not an isolated event. It is the culmination of a 15-year strategy. China is not merely fleeing the burning building. They are constructing a new one. The West has largely ignored the rise of the BRICS alliance. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. For years, Western analysts dismissed it as a loose club of developing economies with little in common. They were wrong. The BRICS alliance represents over 40% of the global population and a rapidly growing share of the world's GDP. But more importantly, it represents a unified desire to escape the hegemony of the U.S. dollar. In August of 2023, the tectonic shift accelerated. The alliance invited new members: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Iran, and Ethiopia. Pause and consider the significance of this. Saudi Arabia, the very linchpin of the petrodollar system, the country that gave the dollar its global utility in 1974, has now joined an alliance explicitly designed to bypass the dollar. The energy giants of the world are joining hands with the manufacturing giants of the world to create a closed loop of trade that excludes the United States. China has been meticulously laying the plumbing for this new financial order. They have established bilateral currency swap lines with nations across the globe, allowing trade to settle in yuan, rubles, or reals, bypassing the dollar entirely. They have built the CIPS payment system, a direct rival to the Western-controlled SWIFT network. They have prepared the infrastructure for a world where the dollar is just one currency among many, rather than the sun around which all other assets orbit. But the final nail in the coffin, the true assassin's mace in China's arsenal, is not digital. It is ancient. It is gold. While the United States has been busy expanding its debt ceiling and debating modern monetary theory, China has been on the greatest gold buying spree in modern history. The official numbers reported by the People's Bank of China claim they hold around 2,000 tons of gold. But in the opaque world of Chinese state finance, official numbers are merely shadows on a wall. Independent analysts, tracking mining output, imports through Hong Kong and Switzerland, and domestic production estimate the true figure is staggering. It is believed that China may actually possess between 20,000 and 30,000 tons of physical gold. This would be nearly 4 times the official holdings of the United States, assuming the gold in Fort Knox is even still there. Why does this matter? Because in a world of fiat currencies, where money is backed by nothing but faith and government promises, gold remains the only true immutable standard. It cannot be printed. It cannot be hacked. It cannot be debased by a central banker's decree. It has been money for 5,000 years, and it will be money long after the dollar has faded into history. Imagine the scenario that keeps Western central bankers awake at night. China announces that the yuan is now convertible into gold. Not a promise, but a mechanism. Suddenly, the world is presented with a choice. On one hand, you have the U.S. dollar, a currency backed by $35 trillion of debt, a paralyzed political system, and a central bank that prints money to pay its own interest. On the other hand, you have a currency backed by the hard reality of physical gold. In that moment, Gresham's law takes effect. Bad money drives out good, but smart money flees to quality. Central banks around the world, currently holding trillions in U.S. treasuries, would face a panic. They would realize that the music has stopped. The rush to the exits would not be a polite transition, it would be a stampede. This is the context of the $3 trillion exodus. China is not selling because they need the cash. They are selling because they know what is coming. They are liquidating their position in a dying empire to secure their seat at the head of the new one. They are cashing in their chips while the casino is still open, knowing that the house is about to go bust. The sale on November 15th was the signal. It was the moment the smart money decided that the American experiment in unlimited debt had reached its mathematical limit. And while the American public worries about grocery bills and gas prices, they remain largely unaware that the very foundation of their purchasing power, the global demand for the dollar, is being dismantled, brick by golden brick. This is not just a story about finance. It is a story about the end of an era. It is a story about the consequences of hubris. And for the average American, the implications are catastrophic. When the dollar loses its reserve status, the economic gravity that has held up the American standard of living will simply cease to exist. The cheap imports, the low interest rates, the ability to borrow from the future to pay for the present, all of it relies on a world that is willing to hold our dollars. China has signaled that they are no longer willing. And where China goes, the global south follows. The exodus has begun. The dollar is dying, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a sell order executed in a dark pool exchange. Now, some of you might be pausing to ask a very pragmatic question. You might be sitting there looking at these astronomical figures, trillions of dollars, sovereign wealth funds, international bond markets, and thinking, so what? China sells some bonds. Governments argue over currency. How does a ledger entry in Beijing actually affect the price of milk in Ohio or my ability to pay rent in Manchester? That is the most dangerous question of all, because it assumes that the financial world is separate from the real world. It assumes that money is just a neutral way to keep score. But it is not. The movement of capital on this scale is not merely a technical adjustment, it is a weather event. When a butterfly flaps its wings, it may cause a storm, but when a dragon moves its hoard, it causes an earthquake. To understand why this $3 trillion exodus is a direct threat to your personal survival, we must peel back the layers of the global economic onion. We must look at the machinery that has allowed the West to live in a state of artificial abundance for the last 5 decades. We must understand the mechanism that China has just decided to dismantle. For the past 50 years, the United States dollar has not just been a currency. It has been the operating system of the planet. It is the language that global trade speaks. If a timber company in Canada wants to sell lumber to a construction firm in Vietnam, they do not trade Canadian dollars for Vietnamese dong. That market is too illiquid, the exchange rates are too volatile. Instead, they both convert to U.S. dollars to settle the trade. The dollar is the bridge. This ubiquity gave birth to a system known as the petrodollar. The origins of this system are often glossed over in history books, but they are the key to understanding the current crisis. In 1971, the United States was in trouble. We had spent too much money fighting the war in Vietnam and expanding the welfare state at home. The French and the British demanded that we redeem their paper dollars for gold, as was the promise of the Bretton Woods Agreement. But we didn't have enough gold. So, on a Sunday evening in August, President Richard Nixon went on television and temporarily suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The temporary measure, of course, became permanent. The dollar was suddenly unmoored. It was backed by nothing but the faith of the government. To prevent the dollar from collapsing into irrelevance, the U.S. needed a new anchor. They found it in the desert of the Middle East. In 1974, a secret deal was struck. The United States would provide military hardware and absolute protection to the Royal House of Saud. In exchange, the Saudis would price their oil, the lifeblood of the industrial world, exclusively in US dollars. And they would take their surplus profits and recycle them back into US Treasury bonds. The brilliance of this arrangement cannot be overstated. By linking the dollar to oil, the United States forced every nation on Earth to hoard dollars. If Italy wanted heat for the winter, it needed dollars. If Japan wanted fuel for its factories, it needed dollars. This created a permanent, artificial demand for American paper. This demand is what gave America its exorbitant privilege. It allowed the United States to live beyond its means for generations. We could run massive trade deficits. We could import cheap electronics, cheap clothes, and cheap food, and pay for them with money we simply created out of thin air. The rest of the world had to work hard to produce real goods, cars, oil, microchips, to earn dollars. We simply had to print them. It was the greatest economic magic trick in history. But magic requires a willing audience. It requires the suspension of disbelief. The world accepted this unfair system because the United States provided stability. The dollar was the safe haven. It was neutral ground. However, over the last 2 decades, and accelerating rapidly in the last few years, the United States has broken the social contract. We stopped being the neutral guardian of commerce and started becoming the weaponized gatekeeper. We printed trillions of dollars to fund wars in the Middle East, to bail out Wall Street in 2008, and to stimulate the economy during the pandemic. With every trillion printed, we diluted the savings of every nation holding our debt. We exported our inflation to the developing world. But the true breaking point was not monetary, it was geopolitical. We began to use the dollar as a weapon of war. When the United States disagrees with a country's policies, we sanction them. We cut them off from the SWIFT payment system, effectively excommunicating them from the global economy. We froze the sovereign assets of Afghanistan. We froze hundreds of billions of dollars belonging to the Russian central bank. Regardless of your opinion on the politics of these nations, the financial message sent to the rest of the world was chillingly clear. Your money is not yours. It is allowed to exist only by the permission of the United States Treasury. If you cross a political line, your national savings can be deleted. China has been watching this weaponization with cold calculation. They understood that as long as they held $3 trillion in U.S. assets, they were vulnerable. They were holding the debt of a rival that could decide to default on them or freeze their funds at any moment. They realized that in a potential conflict over Taiwan or the South China Sea, their dollar holdings would be their Achilles heel. And so the exodus is not just about economics, it is about survival. The $3 trillion sell-off is the clearing of the decks before the storm. But China is not just selling, they are building. You cannot tear down the old house until you have built a new one to live in. And that is exactly what they have been doing, brick by brick, alliance by alliance. The mainstream media often dismisses the BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as a loose talk shop with no real power. This is a fatal underestimation. These nations represent the engines of the physical world. They control the oil, the rare earth minerals, the agricultural output, and the manufacturing capacity of the planet. They are the producers. The G7 nations, by contrast, are largely consumers, heavily reliant on financial services and debt. In August 2023, the BRICS alliance expanded, inviting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Iran, and Ethiopia to join. Pause and look at that list again. Saudi Arabia and Iran, historical enemies sitting at the same table. The UAE, a global financial hub. Egypt, the guardian of the Suez Canal. Ethiopia, the rising power of East Africa. The inclusion of Saudi Arabia is the most significant geopolitical event since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Remember, the Saudis were the anchor of the petrodollar. By joining an alliance explicitly designed to de-dollarize global trade, they are signaling the end of the 1974 agreement. They are stating quietly but firmly that the future of oil is not the dollar. China has been facilitating this transition with bilateral trade agreements. They are buying oil from Russia in yuan. They are trading with Brazil in reals. They are building a web of currency swap lines that bypass New York entirely. The goal is not to replace the dollar with the yuan overnight. China knows the world does not trust their capital controls yet. The goal is to create a multipolar system where the dollar is irrelevant to their strategic interests. But a fiat currency, even one from a rising superpower, is still just paper. To truly break the dollar's hegemony, China needs something more than alliances. They need something that carries the weight of history. They need the ultimate form of money. They need gold. While American investors have been distracted by Bitcoin and the stock market bubble, the People's Bank of China has been engaged in the most aggressive accumulation of physical gold since the Second World War. The official numbers released by Beijing claim they hold roughly 2,200 tons of gold. But in the world of strategic finance, official numbers are often a mask. Those who track the flow of gold, the refiners in Switzerland, the exchanges in Hong Kong, and the mining output within China itself, tell a different story. China is the world's largest producer of gold, yet they do not export a single ounce. Every ounce mined in China stays in China. On top of that, they have been importing massive quantities through proxy buyers. Independent estimates suggest that China's true gold reserves are not 2,000 tons, but closer to 20,000 or even 30,000 tons. If these estimates are even half true, it means China holds more gold than the United States, Germany, and the IMF combined. Why does this matter? Because gold is the assassin's mace. It is the one asset that creates instant credibility. Imagine a scenario where the dollar begins to hyperinflate. The world loses confidence in American debt. In that moment of chaos, China unveils its true reserves. They announce that the yuan, or perhaps a new BRICS trade settlement currency, is partially backed by gold. They invite holders of this new currency to exchange it for physical metal on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Overnight, the balance of financial power would shift from west to east. A currency backed by debt and political dysfunction cannot compete with a currency backed by tangible value. The dollar would not just decline, it would be abandoned. This is the end game that the $3 trillion exodus is preparing for. China is getting out of the dollar while the getting is good. They are converting paper promises into hard assets and strategic alliances. They are selling at the top of the market, leaving the Western pension funds and retail investors holding the bag. And when the rest of the world realizes what is happening, when the central banks of Europe, Japan, and South America realize that the petrodollar is dead and the gold yuan is rising, the panic will not be contained. Every central bank holds trillions in U.S. treasuries. It is their savings account. If they all rush to sell at once, the value of those bonds goes to zero. This brings us back to you. To your mortgage, your grocery bill, and your retirement account. Because if the dollar loses its status as the global reserve currency, the economic reality of America changes instantly. The privilege of printing money disappears. The ability to borrow cheaply disappears. Let me paint a picture of what that world looks like. It begins with interest rates. Currently, the U.S. government can borrow money at relatively low rates because there is a global demand for our debt. But if China sells and Saudi Arabia sells and Japan sells, who buys? To attract buyers, the U.S. Treasury would have to raise interest rates dramatically. We are not talking about a small hike. We are talking about rates that would make the 1980s look mild. Mortgage rates could hit 15% or 20%. The housing market would freeze instantly. Business loans would become unaffordable, leading to mass layoffs. The cost of servicing the national debt would consume the entire federal budget, forcing the government to either default or print money into oblivion. This is the precipice we are standing on. The sale of $3 trillion in assets was not just a trade. It was the sound of the first domino falling. The kinetic energy has been released, and it is traveling through the system, heading straight for the foundation of the American economy. Let us paint a picture of the world that emerges when the dust settles. We have spoken of the mechanisms of high finance, of bond yields, sovereign wealth funds, and the chessboard of geopolitics. But for the average citizen, these terms often feel distant, like the weather reports from a foreign continent. However, the storm that China has unleashed by liquidating $3 trillion in assets will not stay offshore. It is making landfall, and its impact will be intimate, personal, and devastating. To understand what happens next, we must understand the terrifying mechanics of a sovereign debt crisis. For decades, the United States has enjoyed a unique luxury. We could borrow money cheaper than almost anyone else on Earth. This was not because we were fiscally responsible, far from it. It was because the world had no choice but to park their savings in U.S. Treasury bonds. It was the only game in town. This insatiable foreign demand kept our interest rates artificially low. It is the reason you could get a mortgage at 3% just a few years ago. It is the reason the government could finance a $35 trillion deficit without the entire system collapsing. But when China sells, and when the BRICS nations follow, that artificial demand evaporates. The greater fool theory, the idea that there will always be someone else to buy our debt, suddenly fails. When the biggest buyers in the room leave the table, who is left to buy American debt? To attract new buyers, the United States Treasury will have no choice but to offer significantly higher returns. This means interest rates must rise. And they will not rise by 0.25%. They will skyrocket. Imagine a world where the 30-year mortgage rate is not 7%, but 15% or 18%. In this world, the American housing market does not just cool down, it freezes solid. Home values would collapse, erasing the primary source of wealth for the middle class. Construction sites would fall silent across the country because no developer can borrow at those rates to build. The dream of homeownership, already fading for many, would become a mathematical impossibility for an entire generation. But it goes deeper than housing. The entire American economy runs on credit. Cars are bought on credit. Small businesses operate on revolving lines of credit. Corporations issue bonds to fund their payrolls. If the base cost of money doubles or triples, the gears of commerce grind to a halt. We would see a wave of corporate bankruptcies that would make the 2008 financial crisis look like a dress rehearsal. Unemployment would surge not because there is no work to be done, but because the financing required to pay workers has become prohibitively expensive. However, a depression caused by high interest rates is only the first horseman of this economic apocalypse. The second is far more insidious. It is a phenomenon known to economists as reverse currency flow, but you can think of it as a tsunami returning to shore. For 50 years, the United States' greatest export has not been cars or wheat or movies. It has been the U.S. dollar itself. We have exported trillions of dollars to foreign nations in exchange for their goods. These dollars sit in the vaults of foreign central banks, in the accounts of foreign corporations, and under the mattresses of citizens in unstable nations. As long as the dollar is the reserve currency, these dollars stay overseas. They are removed from the U.S. domestic supply. But if the dollar loses its crown, if China and the BRICS succeed in creating a viable alternative backed by gold and commodities, those dollars will no longer be needed abroad. They will come home. Trillions of dollars, previously locked away in foreign reserves, will flood back into the domestic U.S. economy. They will be chasing the same amount of goods and services. This is the classic definition of inflation, but on a scale that few Americans can comprehend. We are not talking about the 8% or 9% inflation that caused panic in recent years. We are staring into the maw of hyperinflation. History is littered with the corpses of currencies that died this way. Weimar Germany in the 1920s, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Argentina today. In a hyperinflationary scenario, money ceases to be a store of value and becomes a hot potato. You get paid in the morning, and you rush to the grocery store to spend every cent before noon, because by dinner time the prices will have risen again. Your life savings, the 400 wunk you have diligently contributed to for decades, would not technically disappear. the numbers would still be there on the screen. But their purchasing power would be incinerated. $1 million might be enough to buy a modest used car. The social contract, the promise that if you work hard and save, you will be secure, would be torn to shreds. This kind of economic violence destroys the middle class, wipes out the elderly on fixed incomes, and tears the fabric of society apart. Third, we must confront the painful reality of the American standard of living. For 2 generations, Americans have lived in a bubble of artificial abundance. We consume far more than we produce. We run massive trade deficits year after year. We enjoy cheap electronics, cheap clothing, and year-round produce, all subsidized by an overvalued dollar. We have been able to do this because the world was willing to trade their sweat, their resources, and their finished goods for our paper. We gave them green pieces of paper. They gave us refrigerators, televisions, and oil. It was the greatest deal in the history of civilization for the consumer. But when the dollar is dethroned, that party ends. The exorbitant privilege becomes the exorbitant penalty. Without the reserve currency status, the value of the dollar relative to other currencies will plummet. Suddenly, imports become excruciatingly expensive. The cost of a smartphone, a pair of sneakers, or a gallon of gas will reflect the true labor and resource costs, no longer subsidized by monetary hegemony. Americans will be forced to confront a brutal decline in their quality of life. We will have to learn to live within our means, not as a choice, but as a necessity imposed by physics. The era of mindless consumption will be replaced by an era of scarcity and conservation. This psychological shock, the realization that the future will be poorer than the past, is something the American psyche is wholly unprepared for. Finally, we arrive at the crisis of the state itself, the fiscal cliff. The United States government is currently over $35 trillion in debt. This number is growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. This debt load is only sustainable because interest rates have been low, and the Federal Reserve could print money to buy the debt that no one else wanted. But in a post-dollar world, this Ponzi scheme collapses. If the government tries to print money to pay its bills when foreign demand is gone, it will simply pour gasoline on the fire of hyperinflation. If they try to raise taxes to cover the gap, they will crush an already dying economy. Washington will face a choice between 2 nightmares. Option 1, default on the national debt. This would mean telling bondholders, including U.S. pension funds and insurance companies, that they are not getting paid. This would trigger a total collapse of the banking system. Option 2, massive immediate austerity. Imagine a budget where Social Security is cut by 50%, where Medicare is dismantled, where the defense budget is slashed, closing bases and grounding fleets, where federal funding for highways, schools, and hospitals simply stops. These are the kinds of choices that lead to social unrest, political radicalism, and the breakdown of order. Now I know what you are thinking. As you listen to this, a part of your mind is rejecting it. It feels too extreme, too apocalyptic. You are thinking, surely the government has a plan. Surely the Federal Reserve, the smartest economists in the room, can stop this. You want to believe there is a safety net. But the tragedy of this moment is that the trap has already been sprung. The United States had 50 years to fix its fiscal house. We had 50 years to invest in productive capacity, to pay down debt, to build a resilient economy that didn't rely on the dollar's monopoly. Instead, we squandered that time on financial engineering, endless wars, and political polarization. China knows this. They have calculated the checkmate. They know that the U.S. cannot raise interest rates high enough to defend the dollar without destroying its own economy. They know the U.S. cannot print its way out without triggering hyperinflation. They have pinned the king. The $3 trillion sale on November 15th was not a gamble. It was a verdict. It was the sound of the developing world voting with their wallets, declaring that the American century is over. China has spent 15 years preparing for this transition. They have built the lifeboats. They have the gold. They have the manufacturing base. They have the energy alliances. They are ready to weather the storm they are creating. The United States, distracted by internal division and blinded by hubris, is standing on the beach, watching the water recede, wondering where the ocean went, unaware that the wave is already towering above the horizon. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is accounting. It is the inevitable correction of a system that has been out of balance for too long. The pendulum is swinging back. The dollar's reign was an anomaly in history, not the rule. And as it ends, the world we return to will be harder, colder, and much more real. The exodus has begun. The capital is leaving. And for those holding dollars, hoping that yesterday's rules will apply to tomorrow's chaos, the wake-up call will be unforgiving.